was the last time you played a low power game of EDH? Was it a upgraded precon, or was it one that you purposefully made weaker? Or heck, was it a high power deck that you completely tried to skirt around being a CEDH deck versus a 9 power level deck? And what does that even mean? I mean, there's been so much popularization over the past 5-6 years with content creators and certain discords about power level, what it means to be a 5 power level deck or a 9 power level deck, which is not a CEDH deck, but it's very hyper focused. I mean, let me know in the comment section down below what your average low power EDH game experience is. Are there more combos, hyper synergies? Are a lot of people even winning with commander damage? And are a lot of those games precons? It feels like these days, with the hyper fixation around EDH products, that inevitably they become built better through consumer demand. There's more mana rocks in them, the mana bases are better, and it feels like, honestly, it very plug and play is the name of the experience you would give it when you open up a precon. It feels like they can hold their own at many quote-unquote low power tables because the synergies are designed pretty well. There are certain key pieces missing, but that's up to you to upgrade and add. But once you do that, does it feel like the power level goes too far? Again, I'm really interested to hear, in low power tables, when's the last time you actually played what you would consider a 2, 3, heck, even 4 power level deck? It feels like not CEDH, it feels like precons these days are like 5s and 6s, and the truly 1 and 2 power level decks are ones that you purposely build with like 50-cent cards. Like, you know, when you make your EDH deck building budget like $20 or less, it feels like you purposely have to challenge yourself. And do those games go longer, shorter? It really is a wholehearted discussion around, does power level matter? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today with your classic low effort React content. I'm going to talk about a channel I recently discovered called the Salubrious Snail, which I highly recommend you give a sub to. They're a channel talking about the kind of deck building aspect of EDH and a little bit of theory just through some commentary. They have some great videos on some great topics, and again, as with me reacting to this video, I highly recommend you check out the video, link down below, give it a like, give them a sub, and honestly give them the analytics they deserve. This channel, I mean, definitely what I would consider relatively high up there in terms of subscribers for a Magic content creator, but they definitely deserve way more. So let's hop right into the video and talk about power level when it comes to Elder Dragon Highlander. I love the simplistic, like, stick figure art style. Just get your point across, and it adds a little bit of humor to the simplicity of it. But let's blow up the video and press play.
You've probably had a game like this. Somebody starts doing some nutty stuff surprisingly early in the game, really going ham with their pieces of cardboard, and by the time they've achieved a decisive win a handful of turns later, one or more other players are sitting dejectedly and grumbling to themselves that this matchup was unfair. Power level differences within a table can be a tricky thing to navigate. You know,
a lot of this can actually just be personal dynamics too. I think what a lot of people forget is that the power scaling is so simplistic. Like the differences between a 6 to 7 can be so large, especially in terms of personal beliefs, right? A lot of people might throw a great henge into a deck, and in my opinion, that just shoots up a deck like at least up to like a 7 or 8 or something, right? And they're like, oh, I don't have any synergies with it, I don't have this, I don't have that. It feels like one of those cards that, similar to the One Ring, where when you play it, it really polarizes the game around it, where if you do not destroy it, if you do not get rid of it, if the Great Henge player is allowed to get away with everything they're about to do with that card, they are skyrocketed so far ahead of the game. And I think there's small synergies like this that a lot of people miss, that it's not the deck, it's a key moment in the game that you decided not to interact with, or you made very poor deck building or gameplay decisions that let this happen. And a lot of people then just say, oh, your commander's busted, your deck's built too well. No, I just think you chose to subconsciously or consciously not deal with something, let other people deal with it, and unfortunately it beat you in the game. And I think that's where people just have this discrepancy of like, oh, that's not a 7 power level deck, that's not a whatever power level deck. It's kind of just, you need to get better at making gameplay decisions, considering how this game has really become like power crept.
It's not fun if a game ends up being an absolute blowout, with some players feeling like they didn't even get a chance. And I generally encourage trying to coordinate power levels to some degree at your tables.
Yeah, that's good. You should.
You want to know a secret? In most cases like this, the relative power levels of the decks aren't even the main issue. Decks with varied power levels can work fine in the same pod, and games can avoid this blowout issue. But this requires a couple things to be true, and the first one of these is very simple. Decks should run interaction.
Oh my god, literally what I just said. So many Commander players, I talked about this in a previous video, and let me know in the comment section down below, how many of you have been in a game of Commander and someone said, oh, if I had the board wipe here, we would be fine. If I had the farewell here, if I had the Wrath of God, like, how many times has someone brought up a board wipe like Cyclonic Rift instead of something like Beast Within, Infernal Grasp, Bolt Bend on the screen here? How many times have people brought up a board wipe versus single target removal? You know, when it comes to white decks, if you go on EDH Rec right now, about, I believe, over 50% of decks in general are playing like Sword to Plowshares and Path to Exile in white, right? Those are like the 50, you know, it's not 50, sorry, the most played white cards according to EDH Rec. So there's a lot of single target removal. I think that speaks to the power of quote unquote exiling. But how many people just refer to board wipes as removal versus single target removal? I think it's just it's just like bad deck building, and whether that be because of like, you know, recommendations for content creators, websites like EDH Rec, that's like a more nuanced discussion. But I think a lot of people, literally from what I just said, do not play interaction the way they should be playing interaction. They either hate counter spells or they think their group's gonna kind of hate them out, and so that's like a further like interpersonal discussion of kind of group politics and group dynamics, which, I mean, I think a lot of people just need to grow up from. I think a lot of people have like EDH pods that they should be a lot more confident to speak in, especially considering like a lot of their LGSs are probably very good environments. I think some LGSs are nightmare places, but... I mentioned
in my last video how a key table dynamic that keeps powerful decks in check in a multiplayer format is the ability for multiple other players to trade cards 1-for-1 with a player who is ahead. And I don't think I need to say much else to make clear the problem with a lot of casual EDH tables. They can't do this because they don't run enough ways to trade cards like this. A lot of decks throw in some mid-single digits number of generic removal spells and or counter spells, and then call it good.
I think that's pretty fair,
the rest of their deck on their engines and synergies and whatnot.
See, like, it's like, it'll be like stuff like this, right? Like further exemplified though. And I feel like this is what purposely keeps like a deck like lower power. It's like a subtle balance, right? Like once you become hyper focused around, like, let's say you just remove like 6 of these cards and added 6 more single target removals pieces or interaction or consistency pieces, doesn't it start to look like a high power EDH deck or a CDH deck, right? Where you're focused around maybe just winning with Sanguine Blood and other pieces of combo. You're focused around winning with, I don't know, like Light of Promise or something. I don't know, right? Like you're focused around winning with a couple of different pieces. You may look to them and then you interact in ways that don't really affect those win conditions, but then affect your opponent's board. That starts to look a bit more focused. So it's always this subtle balance, right? And so I think with something like this, I think people can make conscious decisions to be playing better removal in these spots if they have the budget or the resources to achieve those cards. But they can also make conscious decisions to maybe play a bit more, like some more lands, to have more consistent land drops, or play more mana rocks, or, you know, just dedicate more slots, right? Like you could remove like 2 to 3 of these cards, play some more removal, and really get there. Like honestly, one of my favorite removal spells in black and white is Damn. That's a great card. It's a single target removal spell that can turn into a board wipe. That's a great example of a flexible card. Honestly, all 5 of those cards mentioned are like pretty solid right there.
Building up their deck's ability to function against no opponents. Then, when a pod of these decks show up to a table, before too long, a player will naturally start to get ahead, and their opponents won't have a lot of recourse for it. This amplifies power differences, because if a deck is even a little better at what it does, say generating an extra half of a card per turn in value, there will be nothing to prevent that advantage from piling up at an interactionless table. A compounding factor for this sort of dynamic is when decks have high variance. I think the best way to quantify this is to think about the difference between the deck's 75th percentile situation, when it's playing somewhat better than average, and the deck's 25th percentile situation, when it's playing somewhat worse than average. Most well-constructed decks will have...
So this is kind of a discussion around the very more technical explanation of the discussion around the floor of a deck and the ceiling of a deck. So what's happening when, maybe not like as specifically, but what's happening when the deck is doing really well and what's happening when the deck is doing not what it needs to do. Maybe it's missing a land drop or two, like it's an artifact deck and you don't have any of your mana rocks out. It is a creature deck that has like 10 creatures out on the board and a token generator, you know, that's like kind of the 75th percentile. Like what's happening at that point?
Some difference between these two, but not a massive one. Your 25th percentile situation won't feel great, but you'll still have plays you're setting up for and goals you're making progress toward.
Right.
And maybe you're just playing a bit slower, a bit riskier, or a bit less interactive than usual. By contrast, a lot of casual EDH decks I've seen were built putting so much emphasis on the ideal scenario, the big pop-off factor, that as much as 25% or 30% or even 40% of the time, they fail to perform meaningful game actions. This comes down to one thing above all others: putting in too many payoff cards and not enough building blocks to get there.
Yeah, so this is genuinely like people that don't play enough mana rock or ramp. Like that's all this is, right? And obviously if you're playing a monocolored deck, if you're playing like a mono black deck and stuff like that, you don't have the options such as like rampant growths from green. If you're playing, you know, if you're playing like the red decks, like they have a lot of impulse draw, which you don't necessarily have in green versus red. And so like there are different ways though, right? Like unfortunately and fortunately, I guess EDH has become like very homogenous in a lot of the abilities that it has. I mean, heck, black has enchantment removal, right? Like that's a thing that decks have access to, and so you can make better deck building decisions whether or not you consciously or unconsciously need to make them. I think a lot of people make conscious decisions to not play certain strategies, which is perfectly fine. Maybe you're going for something hyper synergistic, you were trying to match what you feel a certain commander would play around, and that's great. That's a thematic decision. That's not what this is about. These are for people that want to play a certain power level but are making conscious decisions to play like Harmonize in green. But like they say, like you're playing Harmonize in green, but you're telling me that your deck is a 7 power level. I don't believe you. Like you're lying, right? And you're not going to have a great time when I play my actual 7 power level card. Someone like, okay, again, in the comment section down below, why would you play Harmonize in a 7 power level deck? Just someone tell me, like genuinely tell me, and just, I don't know how you want to get my attention, but I'm actually genuinely curious why you'd play Harmonize in like a 7 power level deck. But I think that's like a good example of this.
I'd categorize payoff cards into two types. One is amplification cards. Cards that convert your tokens into more tokens, your counters into more counters, your damage into more damage, and your draw into more draw. Some number of these cards can be decent for a deck, especially cards that can rapidly lead to a win or which synergize with a type of card you'll have especially ample access to. However, if you run too many of these and too few things to be amplified, your game plan will be fragile.
Like a lot of these for me, especially once you start leveling up like your EDH deck building, you'll find that a lot of these cards, just like they fall into a category of cards that don't do anything by themselves, right? Like all these cards right here, they don't do anything by themselves. You cast them, they do nothing. You need to play them and pass the turn. Hardened Scale is a little bit easier, but like this is one of the Hardened Scale specifically I'm mentioning because it was one of those cards that comes stock in the Mothman precon. And I found that like, okay, people understand that the Mothman EDH deck, generally speaking, is very much built around the commander. You kind of need to have that out, or you need to build it completely different to not having it out. You need to have like a counters go wide strategy. And so something like Hardened Scales only works if you build around it or have your commander out. And when you don't have that, what are you doing? And so there are other effects that do things like this, that are a body, that have a slightly different effect, right? Like there's one out there, I'm forgetting the name of it right now off the top of my head, but it's like a mana rock, and it's like green and 2, you tap it, and then you add mana of one color equal to the amount of 1/1 counters on it, and it has a similar effect to Hardened Scales. And that is better to me because yes, it costs 3, but then it has a mana rock on top of it. It's a creature, like it draws a different type of attention, and it does something slightly different in a non-interactive situation. And I think like that's where you kind of mix the idea of hyper synergy and still kind of like a payoff, right? Like it's doing everything, and those are the type of upgrades that you're really looking for. I will say, you know, something like these that are mentioned, like they're generally like 4 costs. This isn't that bad. Like Teferi's Ageless Insight, pretty solid, and like Second Harvest, I mean, like this card's great, right? Like I don't know, like generally speaking, if you're putting Second Harvest in a deck, I kind of trust you to at least be making like food tokens or something.
A while back, I had a series of games with a Zaxara player who would play multiple counter doublers and mana doublers and various other doublers, followed by a single premium Hydra, maybe a second one if they got lucky.
What?
If that Hydra had survived a turn cycle, they probably would have smacked down the table in short order.
Right.
But in all the games this happened, a single removal spell was played.
Right.
The Zaxara player had no counter magic, and just like that,
you're playing blue. Why don't you have
pile of synergy permanents were rendered a total non-threat.
Yeah.
I don't want to be too hard on this player since it seemed like their deck was pretty newly built at the time and hadn't been tested much. But this is an example of a trap that's pretty easy to fall into if you're not careful and are just adding stuff that looks...
I feel like that player probably improved their deck like soon after. Or I hope they did. I hope they didn't feel bad about it. I hope this is another thing. And this is like a human problem, like how you take certain learning moments. I hope this person took that learning moment and actually made changes and didn't
of those additions.
Get overly upset.
The other main type of payoff card is what I'll call conversion cards. Ones that give you one type of resource as a result of having or spending a different one. For example, spending mana to draw cards when you've gained life, drawing cards based on having a bunch of creatures of the same type,
shout out to Distant Melody
based on how many cards are in your graveyard, and creating angels when you play enchantments.
As
with amplification cards, these aren't inherently bad, and are indeed a perfectly solid type of card in moderation. But running too many of these resource conversion cards will have problematic results for deck consistency. If your deck's core building blocks already require you to be doing well in some capacity, you're limiting your ability to get your game plan going in the first place. Pair this with running an excessive quantity of amplification cards as well, and you'll find that your deck will struggle to get into gear consistently, will struggle to play through interaction, and will struggle to get up off the floor after it's been shut down. Sure, you'll have the crazy pop-off games from time to time where things line up just right, but the overall result of a high variance deck like this is this sort of all or nothing dynamic that I find very negative. And if the whole table is...
So it really depends on the type of players and I guess like the table. So he's probably about to go into like the table dynamics of this, where if every player had a situation like this, kind of who pops off first, right? It's like, it feels like two ships passing in the night. And I think like there are like the higher level players that understand. One that I like to repeat, a stat that I like to repeat for all of my EDH related videos is that 25% of the time you're going to be winning the game, assuming all things are equal in a 4-player pod. If you play 4-player games over and over and over again, assuming everything is equal, everyone gets a chance to win, you only win 25% of the time. And so once you realize that and really internalize that, you start to understand, okay, what does it mean for me to play this game of EDH? Yes, I want to win, but maybe I can set myself a goal. Maybe I want to try and draw a certain amount of cards at a base level, or get a certain synergy going, or try and interact or get to a certain turn or control the game to a certain point, or blah, 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 right? Like you can set yourself many goals, and then those goals can help direct how you want to win this game and help you kind of adapt and build into the situation that's presenting itself. Maybe your opponent is playing their commander super early. How does your goal then adapt to something like that? And once you start doing things like that, you can find that your deck already starts to kind of change in your mind, because you're like, oh, I really had fun building towards this goal. Maybe I do want to remove these hyper synergistic cards because I realized that like, oh, I only need 2 of them maybe instead of 4 of them. And then I could play more interaction because I had more fun reaching this goal, which required me to interact with my opponent if they did X. And so I find like that's like a helpful way to make changes like this. But
playing this sort of deck, differences in deck power levels will naturally be amplified wildly. When one player gets the lucky pop-off, whereas the others get stuck with dead hands full of unmet payoff cards, and especially when nobody has interaction to close this sort of gap in performance, decks can feel poorly matched and power imbalanced even when they're the exact same power level.
Yes.
As a foil to these sorts of decks, I'm going to dig back into my past for a moment and talk about a couple decks I built a few years ago. From 2019 to 2022, my playgroup, mostly made up of broke college students at that point, played exclusively with a pool of 10 $30 EDH decks, and we agonizingly tuned and pruned and fully rebuilt these decks when needed until each of these decks played to a power we were satisfied with.
Okay.
The end result of this process was a pool of decks that are not like most casual EDH decks.
Yo, this is actually the sickest idea in the world. It's like, obviously you have to have everyone involved to do it. Like, you have to have like a shared goal. I think a lot of people, especially as they grow older and everything, you know, they go into their own lives. Like, they obviously want to build their own collections. They come across different commanders, and, you know, they consume different levels of content that expose them to different types of cards. It's a little harder, but in this type of contained environment of broke college students, this is actually like really cool. I love this.
Decks. These decks have been brought to life in a setting that is almost competitive in nature, where there is a meta to keep up with and adapt to, where each deck is played dozens of times over with every single win and loss tracked, and where decks that don't make the cut, that don't win a lot of games, get scrapped without further question. In this environment, decks are built with a high degree of consistency and a lot of interaction because these factors lead decks to win more games in this sort of faux competitive environment. This fact, paired with the low budget, resulted in a format where resiliency and ability to grind were the most important factors for a deck. The funny thing is, despite these decks being built on a low budget and designed to play exclusively against each other, most of these decks still hold up in games with decks that are much more powerful on paper. And a big piece of this is because of their relationship with interaction. Take
That's kind of what I was talking about earlier.
It runs 6 counter spells, 6 removal spells, 2 modal cards that can counter or remove, and 3 stacks cards. In addition, the proactive cards in the deck don't rely on it being ahead or avoiding opposing interaction. Even something like Bident of Thassa generates acceptable amounts of value with a single evasive creature, of which the deck is running 25. These factors work together to make a deck that is very flexible and which can perform actions like hindering its opponents, chipping in damage, and drawing extra cards, even when it's behind. Not only this, but the high watermark of the deck is genuinely pretty high, with 30 plus damage combat steps, massive draw, extra turns, and forcing opponents to discard their hands, all options on the table for the deck. And these plays are important for allowing the deck to get to the finish line once it's ahead. A Rakdos discard deck from the same pool is similarly heavy on interaction. It's running 10 cards plus the commander for removal, as well as 25 cards that cause opponents to discard cards. The deck's cards also work well on their own as a matter of necessity. When a deck's game plan involves forcing the table into a hellbent state, it's not going to play a bunch of stuff that requires lots of setup, because that's the exact sort of deck it's looking to disorient and hinder through discard spells. Both of these decks are consistent, grindy, and interaction dense, leading them to fit in quite well at a variety of different tables, and always feel like they're contributing something to the game, even when other decks have significantly stronger cards. When I reflect on games with these old decks, there's something almost paradoxical at play. These highly optimized decks that are overwhelmingly dedicated to...
And so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where it starts to feel like when you start adding all these pieces of consistency, that 4 or 5 power level deck starts to look very close to an 8 to 9 power level deck, because your plan is hyper focused. It feels like you get to do your thing every game, and that's a very hard point to reach. I think for a lot of EDH players, they don't like really clue into that because they don't experience that. They only see that on one side and they're like, hey, you got to go off, that's not fair, you know, you got your 4 card combo off, blah blah blah. But they don't see the work involved in that. They don't see the commander sphere that was played on turn 3 that allowed them to kind of be 1 mana ahead and then play out more cards more efficiently. You know, they didn't see the 4 mana ramp spell that allowed them to get out 2 basics and kind of like take over the game from there. Like, they didn't see these small plays, they just saw the big cards being cast. They didn't see the build up, and I think that tunnel visioning can be a big negative for a lot of EDH players as well, because they don't understand what it takes to build a hyper synergistic deck. All of a sudden you look across from your opponent and they made like, you know, 10 tokens on 1 turn, got you to lose like 10 life, you discarded 3 cards, and like, wow, your deck is really popping off, it's doing so many things, but then you just didn't spend the time to stop the build up. You didn't counter that ramp spell, or you didn't remove that you know, kind of key like 3 drop that allowed them to go off based on the synergies of them losing life or something like that. Like you didn't stop any of this. You just saw the end result and you're just seeing it pop off, and then you think it's unfair because you think your deck can do that, but it can't. You didn't build your deck that way. And I think it's like you kind of just have to like Like a lot of people, like unless you consume content or really engage in it, they'll never reach that point, which is
nuts and
kind of
bolts
sad.
functionality over all else led to gameplay that was way more fun to me than a lot of games I've played with more conventional EDH decks.
Yeah, these
that
pods
have
are probably
wacky
great.
card choices and perform lots of big splashy plays. Playing decks that are packed with interaction and also resilient to setbacks leads to fewer feel bad, I'm doing nothing type moments, and way more moments where it feels like you're actually playing a multiplayer game where different players are trying to navigate their way to a win while also keeping their opponents in check.
Right.
And this is certainly not to say that playing with a pool of hyper-optimized $30 decks is the only way to achieve this. There are plenty of things that people find fun about EDH that won't be found in an environment like this, and there's a reason my playgroup doesn't play exclusively with these decks anymore. However, I think it's worthwhile to consider these sorts of decks as an example of how EDH can be played. We can think about EDH decks along a spectrum, with the most interactionless high variance decks out there on one end of things, and then decks like these, which prioritize consistency, resiliency, and interactiveness above all else, on the opposite end.
I love how doubling season is seen as uninteractive.
If you're finding your games too frequently feeling like a roll of the dice, where some person happens onto an insane opening and then runs away with the game, just know that swinginess is a malleable feature. You can move along this spectrum of gameplay, and reducing the swinginess of your games can be as simple as following the two deck building tips I've been mentioning in this video, running more interaction and improving a deck's consistency and resilience.
And then you'll start to see that every deck becomes a CEDH deck. I think like that's where it's like, it's kind of like, this is such a hard line to really balance. Like once you're at like a 6 or a 7 power, like a 6 power level deck, a 5 or a 6, it can be very easy to add like 5 cards, 6 cards, and legitimately your deck jumps to an 8. Like legitimately, it's so easy because you kind of have the bones. You start to add some hyper synergy cards or consistency pieces that really elevate your deck. Like all of a sudden you're playing a Faithless Looting. All of a sudden you're playing a Great Henge. All of a sudden you're playing, I don't know, what's another, like the One Ring. I don't know, like you're playing a Ristic Study and a Mystic Remora or something. Like I'm just throwing cards out there. Like once you start like adding piece by piece, you start to add like 6, 5, 6 cards, and your deck jumps up so much because you're playing like you're playing all these different options that really add to the interaction or the longevity of your deck, because you're able to stop what your opponent's doing and then realize when you get to stop them, on your turn you can then play your piece, because then they probably spend so much time pulling the trigger and going off that maybe you were able to stop them, really stop that resource flow, and now they don't really have the cards or the resources necessary to stop you, and now you're able to go off. And obviously it's very kind of linear in a 1v1 scenario. There's obviously going to be 2 other people at the table, so you have to work around the politics of, if you're the last in the rotation, don't be that person. Like follow the rules. Don't be that person to be like, I'll counter it. No. Wait for the other 2 people in that pod to make an interaction. Like genuinely, one of the bigger level up points that I tell like lower level pods is, if I ever join a game like that, I tell them, hey, hold on. You're technically 3rd in this rotation, or 4th in this rotation. Let the other 1 or 2 people go. Do you counter this spell? Do you remove that creature? And you kind of let that happen, and then you start to see the gears turn of these players. You're like, oh wait, they can interact and I can hold my interaction too. They can use their spell and I can hold mine for a future card. And they start to realize like, oh, okay, just because this card completely shatters me doesn't mean I need to answer it, because maybe what I'm not observing is in this specific scenario where I was able to play removal, my opponents are also playing removal in a pod like this. I can then start to force the hand of the table and realize like, hey, maybe it actually stops player number 2 as well. So player number 1 plays their spell. Player number 2 then realizes, well, subconsciously like, okay, I need to get rid of this, because since I'm second in this rotation of 3 other people are interacting, I can't trust those other people to interact based on the amount of mana they have. Whereas secretly, you know that you have the interaction. So player number 2 interacts, they stop the spell, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Player number 3 doesn't care, but you as player number 4 are sitting there like, oh great, now I have this spell pierce, or I have this an offer you can't refuse for a future spell, and they think I don't have it, or they don't think I have this spell that they need to play around. And so those are the type of level up moments that you can have in lower level tables, but it is a slippery slope. Right, as someone who's definitely like not a CEDH player, but prefers to play like 7, 8, 9 power level tables, it's a slippery slope to getting to there and kind of bringing yourself back. And I think that's kind of the toughest thing. Let me know in the comment section down below if you've ever had that type of tough moment where you feel like you're in that slippery slope where you now have to purposely make deck building decisions to lower the power level of your deck. It's definitely something that I've been trying to work on, where in my Mothman deck, I've kind of fully built it out as like a CDH deck with proxies, and I'm purposefully making a second version of the deck that is lower power, that is not playing the tutors, that isn't playing the food chain combo, that is playing maybe a go wide token based strategy with a little bit of protection. So it's still kind of like a 5-6 power level deck, but you know, kind of building it in two different versions so I can give myself perspective. And that's one thing I'm enjoying doing right now. I'm in the process of building that lower power deck. I kind of like almost fully net deck the CEDH version with like Slime Against Humanity straight out of the YouTube video. Shout out to those who know what I'm talking about. But I'm really excited to make decisions like that. I think those really level up your perspective and gameplay prowess as an EDH player. Flexibility is key when it comes to a format like this. By
removing payoff cards that are unnecessary or difficult to fulfill. Doing these things will generally reduce the frustrating feeling of playing a deck that feels like it's doing nothing, and a table with relatively consistent interactive decks will feel much more dynamic and balanced, regardless of how powerful each of those decks actually are.
Okay. Yeah. I should have just let the video finish, but yeah, no, I think power level does matter. And it's so hard to differentiate the heck, like the difference between a 5 and a 6 power level deck. It's such an arbitrary scale. It's not one I think a lot of people are a big fan of, but it definitely does matter. And it's kind of frustrating for a lot of lower power tables. I think for higher power tables, people can make gameplay decisions and outside of game decisions, such as politicking, to advance the game in their favor. Where, you know, I've used this example so many times, but like a Marin player sits there and all of a sudden an opponent is able to resolve a Douthie Voidwalker against them. And they're sitting there like, wow, I do not have a hand that has interaction in this specific case, like, or one that necessarily works here. Like I might have to wait another turn or two to get rid of that, but I was hoping to develop in that turn or two. Well, sucks. I guess I can't play the game. But then you look at that situation, you're like, hey, you know what? I can handle this card right now. I will remove it if you give me a favor that I can take later in this game. Right, and that favor could be maybe not killing me this turn, or using that ability against me, that kind of really puts me back. And they're like, okay, fine, kill it. I can advance the game. And so that's how you can kind of really advise the state of the game, change it to your favor, where now you've gained an additional resource that you can use later in the game, whereas you might have a relatively lower power deck than the Marin player. In that specific situation, you're able to take advantage of the board state and gain an advantage from there. So I think a lot of mid to high level EDH players can do things like that, whereas a lot of lower power EDH games, if it's not purposely done that way, or these players don't have that much experience, they may not be as open to EDH politics. They may see that as unfair. They may see that as king making or ganging up on the table or something like that. It may become a little bit hard to balance, but power level really matters. And I think it's something you learn over time with more experience. So play more games, get better with deck building, consume content, really understand what it means to play your commander. Chances are, if you're playing a popular commander especially, there's probably plenty of YouTube videos, plenty of quote-unquote primers to the deck at lower power and higher power, and really kind of absorb all of that and give yourself all the knowledge. So great video from the Salubrious Snail. Again, highly recommend, give them a sub, watch their other content. I'm definitely kind of going through them slowly myself, but yeah, happy to give you a little low effort react to something like this. But yeah, great video.